Today, three species of overworld humans are recognized: the builders, the villagers, and the illagers. Villagers and illagers are typically grouped into a class called Ligurians. About 800,000 years before Common Era, prehistoric villager tribes on the Illager Island begin to develop gray skin as an evolutionary trait with a currently unknown cause. The Church of Notch portrays illagers as having developed as corrupted villagers, but this is a degrading, dated racist myth with no basis. Illagers share an identical genetic makeup to villagers and are very similar to builders, who are believed to be of a separate, closely related genus, and possibly the oldest human species. Over the next 800,000 years, human civilization rapidly developed and began to consolidate into 4 groups of tribes, all on the mainland. However, illagers remained barbaric tribes on their island. So, for most of early human history, people were primarily nomadic tribes, wandering the land, farming resources, fighting, or hunting down food. However, a little before the year experts officially mark as 0 CE, tribes began to consolidate into larger permanent settlements, and those would eventually merge into city-states, and then that transformed into the 5 great empires more commonly known. The Aurelian Empire, ruled by Rai. It rapidly arose as the technological powerhouse of its time, inventing tools of stone, crafting tables, building houses far grander than those of the villagers. The Obsidian Empire, ruled by Atresia, an impenetrable nation founded near an active volcano that made walls of obsidian hostile to invasion. The Subjugate Empire, ruled by Pionet, a cruel nation that was constantly expanding, leading to their empire becoming the largest of the 5. The Exploration Empire, ruled by Seth, which sought adventure through maritime exploration and naval dominance. The Great Peace began at this time, an era of 436 years of no war, chaos, or destruction. Many leaders came and went. It is believed the empires were seen culturally as less of competing nations, but governors of a common earth, allied under the gods they believed in. Unfortunately, war is far from the only thing that can kill. The Cindervex fever, P. ventrixa, began to spread in the Obsidian Empire outside Steech Volcano. It is caused by the thermophilic spore-borne bacterium Pyrosporidium ventrixa, which thrives in superheated environments near volcanic fault lines and underground magma vents. When cooled inside a human host, the spores become biologically active, rapidly colonizing the respiratory tract. The disease eventually receded, but by the end, almost 4% of the world was dead. It sounds like a measly figure, but extremely few events in history have come anywhere near the death toll. In year 489, the world faced an even stranger threat. Swarms of hostile creatures, the hostile mobs, rose from some pathogen still unknown today. Builders suffered the worst of it. Zombies and skeletons were in fact builders reanimated by a disease after death. Creepers were some form of locomotive plant, one that attacked settlements across the 4 empires. This invasion continually killed thousands, overturned harvests, and caused the governments to begin imposing strict curfews. Massive walls were built, and armies did their best to destroy invaders. The invasion rattled confidence in power and provoked new military thinking. Many nations treated the menace as a symptom of a world growing stranger and more dangerous. But beyond diseases that came and went and occasional attacks from the hostile mob race, peace had ruled for centuries. However, pressure never truly leaves a world. Between recovered plagues and monstrous raids, political fractures widened. Successive emperors, noble factions, and emergent cults, including those obsessing over a rumored half-god, all struggled for advantage. Those ideologies, religious, expansionist, and fearful, set the stage for the crisis to come. By the mid-500s, a single rumor would trigger a sequence of choices no nation could reverse. In year 536, the continent's 5 great polities were awoken to talk of a half-god, a being of unknown origin and rumored power. Some rulers sought to worship and enslave it. Others vowed to destroy it. The belief in such a thing, whether divine or political leverage, was enough to sharpen knives at every court. The Aurelian court, young Emperor Arrian among them, took the half-god rumor as an existential threat. To control or destroy that power might eclipse any rival. So they acted. In the summer of year 537, the Aurelian Empire mustered an army of 100,000 and launched a landing on the Illager island, convinced that the half-god, or those who protected it, resided there. The invasion collapsed in hours. The soldiers who returned were decimated. The Aurelians blamed an otherworldly power. Modern historians read the episode differently, suggesting the attackers fell into ambushes by Illager raiders and were defeated by local tactics, not miracles. It is believed the Aurelians, never having seen a human with gray skin, mistook the Illager Ligurian residents for demons. The Illagers formed their fearsome knife guild, a clan of extremely stealthy and ruthless spies who perform assassinations in the forests. The Aurelians believed them to be Vesper Mortix, a type of demon said to serve the half-god. Vesper Mortix translates to evening death, earning Illigerian barbarians this nickname. Within weeks, the subjugate empire, already roiling at home, launched assaults across the Villigerian plains, and the continent slid from crisis to open war. The fighting did not end quickly. Fronts opened across coasts and plains, and the scale of slaughter set new standards for the age. Decades later, they labeled the whole catastrophe the Power War. The name itself was given retrospectively. By the end, the 5 empires were no longer harmonious, but intensely competing rivals. Following the war, the subjugate empire at home was now facing relentless assaults from its own people who were fed up with the emperor's tyranny. Earlier, they had launched a plot to invade the Aurelian Empire, while the majority of its military was gone, and now continued this plan in an attempt to evoke fear on its own citizens. The Aurelians swiftly responded with war machines, and later developed the Golden Legion, a group of 4,000 to 5,000 elite soldiers bred to be warriors from childhood, equipped with iron and copper armor, golden linen shields, and iron swords. The subjugate empire responded with a large drafting of its citizenry, vastly outnumbering the Aurelians with just sheer peasant numbers, and it worked. Dozens of them were killed in the start of battles easily, but the subjugate numbers reigned supreme when they reached Aurelian war machines. They tackled and stabbed Golden Legion Spartans/knights, disassembled catapults, torched cities, even climbed the walls built. Around this time, the Aurelian knight had finished training in the Golden Legions. Immediately, he was a force, causing alarming casualty ratios, and battles he participated in seemed to never be lost. The knight led entire counterattacks on subjugate camps without commander order, and still won. Later, he would lead a large stand at the castle, and would alone defeat a subjugate army and chase them out of the capital. It was a legendary story where he fought a small army of several thousand who were on foot, initially on horseback himself. However, his horse was later killed, and as he was encircled, he stabbed relentlessly and without end until nothing moved, before collapsing from exhaustion. The Exploration Empire and Obsidian Empire both wanted to destroy the Aurelians out of fear just the same, but are much weaker nations than the others. Initially, talks of an alliance or even unionization were made, but the talks were misinterpreted as threats of annexation, and the two began fighting over their land and control of the demigod, yet even still launched quick assaults on the Aurelians, most of which were quickly extinguished. Some lasted longer, but none made it very far. The war finally ended with the assassination of the subjugate empire's king, which allowed the Aurelian Empire to conquer their land and claim it. Experts are unsure what led to the conclusion, but the Aurelians were now sure they had killed the great demigod in a last-stand battle, leading to them finally retreating from the Illager island, as Arrian passed away of old age in 578. But trouble was brewing off the coasts. From the ruins of the Aurelian landing rose a new order, the Illager Empire. In the century after the failed landing, circa 623, or just shy of 50 years later, disparate Illager warbands centralized under charismatic warlords. The very first Arch-Illager Cardell began the process of union for the past decades by outlawing barbaric groups, and successive leaders, notably Reldak, who came into power 7 years prior as the second Arch-Illager, transformed raiding parties into standing armies and built the ships, engines, and siegecraft needed to contest continental power, even now technologically rivaling the Aurelian Empire. That same year, Reldak led the Illager Empire on a brutal invasion the island territories of the Exploration and Aurelian Empire, mistakenly believing it to be one unified empire. At first, battles are only simple coastal assaults that quickly fail as the Golden Legion destroys attackers. This move begins the First Illager-Aurelian War. The first battle of the official war begins the Illager Uprising. Illagers move further inland, and a brutal confrontation with the Golden Legion ensues. However, the legions reign supreme, winning the battle. The Illagers, long seen as terrorists, are enslaved or forced into tribute. Shortly thereafter, there is a coastal invasion by the Aurelians, countering Illager assault. In 634, an Illager warlord, Vladok, commands a 100-man army of the top Illagerian soldiers, and manages to slaughter waves of the Golden Legion entering via the coast. He is known for using an axe as his battle weapon as opposed to the standard sword, a choice that would later influence Illager war culture. In close conjunction with the second Arch-Illager Reldak, he unites the last of the Illagerian clans through charismatic speeches and sparks a mass rebellion. The entire landmass is now almost in unilateral agreement that the continental threats must be slaughtered. Finally, this 11-year war, which again began in 623, came to an end in 634 after the sack of Drakenshire, a battle where the Aurelian city near the Temperist Sea burned to the ground. However, the Aurelians regroup and push the Illagers back, forcing a peace treaty after a long stalemate. For the first time in centuries, the Aurelians are forced to give up land. The Illager Empire agreed to return Aurelian citizens peacefully. However, Vladok begins killing them all before they are freed. Additionally, Illagerian soldiers now fully utilize axes, a choice commanded by Vladok. After Vladok's massacre, Aurelian nobles blame the empire's current leader, Enton, for weakness. They did not know their citizens were being killed before they could be freed. They had only assumed that they were dead in the battles. Half the Aurelian government demanded military dictatorship and mass arrests followed. However, the truth would come out 6 years later, in 640. The Aurelians learned of Vladok's atrocities, and the next emperor, Silvanus, who was desperate for approval to avoid the shame his predecessor Enton endured, swore revenge, thus beginning the Second Illagerian-Aurelian War. Now a unified empire, the Illagers built their first war machines like catapults and recruited cavalry soldiers over the course of the months, something the Aurelians did not have. The Illagers invade Aurelian lands, sacking over a dozen small villages. The Golden Legion fight with their utmost courage, but are outmatched. For the last 40 years in the First Illigerian-Aurelian War, the Entern Mountains were largely contested, and the narrow path at the foothills next to the Temperist Sea was at a stalemate. However, now the Illigerians were making advances. The Aurelians did not merely surrender, however, as Vladok was killed that year by Emperor Silvanus of Aurelia. For the next 49 years, until 689, the Aurelians unleashed their mighty golden legions at the largest they've ever been, leading to the legendary Battle of the Sunlit Pass, where 10,000 Illigers fought 70,000 specially trained Aurelian soldiers in a brutal mountain battle, in what is now the modern-day Entern Empire. Despite the vast 7-to-1 ratio and great size disadvantage, this battle would go down in history as one of the greatest victories in Illiger Empire history. As bloodshed wrought unchecked and bodies piled high, the war continued to drag on into the next century. 700 CE, the war would finally end that exact year with the fall of Aurelia under Arch-Illiger Carvul, as the Illigers storm the capital and burn its great library. The Aurelian Empire collapses, though remnants of the nation survive the northern lands. The Obsidian Empire and Exploration Empire, who long had hidden behind the walls of Aurelia, now had to face an inevitable demise by the Illiger Empire. The Obsidian Empire, a nation built in near-impenetrable volcanic fortresses, renowned for their unbreakable walls and elite warrior monks, and the Exploration Empire, a maritime empire controlling vast, legendary naval fleets. But the Illiger Empire seeks to dominate the continent. Before more war broke out, the enormous villager exodus occurred where tens of thousands of villagers abandoned loyalty to a nation to form nomadic tribes and settlements in an attempt to escape Illiger enslavement. However, for now, everyone could rest. The Illiger war machine was too resource-exhausted to continue fighting, and the world saw a brief peace for 40 years. However, when that 40-year period finally expired, the Aurelians had somewhat recuperated. A surviving Aurelian warlord, Cassian, returns with an army of exiles, mercenaries, and Obsidian Empire allies to reclaim their homeland. The Aurelian Empire and Illiger Empire clash for the next decade through to 750, seeing little progress on either side. Caspian's battle intelligence is difficult to crush, but the Illiger Empire's insurmountable resources simply cannot be overcome. It is a horrible time, filled with constant death, war, and famine. Not a day goes by where hundreds are not slaughtered by the Illiger and Aurelian destruction. The war was so immensely destructive, it was what caused the extinction of the hostile mob race, effectively wiping them off the planet, and whatever remained was single-handedly wiped out by the Arch-Illiger Valkyr, who also led dozens of assaults on Cassian's camps. Somewhere during the war, in 743, Steech Volcano began its eruption cycle, exploding across the continent with immense fury. To make matters worse, Cindervex fever pathogens were multiplying through the centuries, and now had millions of wounded, tired, and exposed soldiers to infect, thus beginning the Second Cindervex Plague. Many claim Notch had punished humanity for war. However, Steech eruptions were extremely common on a geological scale, as the volcano erupts every 1,000 years, approximately due to unstable underground activity in the nether. The disease spread so far and so effectively, Arch-Illiger Valkyr contracts the disease from the dozens of Aurelians he single-handedly killed and was dead within a month. An extremely cruel irony. Arch-Illiger Dalek would take his place, fighting the war at a snail's crawl. When 750 came around, the war was finally ending thanks to a tragic battle, aptly named the Battle of Blackened Fields. The Illiger Empire triumphed, though both sides, by the end, had suffered hundreds of thousands of deaths, which at the time was roughly half of their populations. It almost irreversibly stunted the global population growth of humanity. Thousands of villager settlements became ghost towns due to the disease, and Dalek was extremely hesitant to build permanent settlements. Famously, there was a quote of his that, translated from Illyrian roughly, said, "The continent has always been a wretched plague to our kind. They are demons from hell, and every land they inhabit is ill, destroyed, or trying to destroy us. The builders are a common filth, but this era is the last they shall ever plague, for today the Illager Empire will kill them all." So, about 15 years pass and the world has gone quiet, with no Aurelia to protect itself from Illager threat. Yet, life inside the Empire's borders is flourishing, which only amplifies support for the destruction of the two empires left. In year 790, Arch-Illager Dolvar takes the throne. He begins a massive armament over the next decade, claiming, "The new century will herald Illager prosperity for good." And he kept his word. In the summer of 800, the Illagers would begin the countdown of the Obsidian Empire's last days. The Illagers redirect lava flows to weaken the obsidian walls, then launch an all-out assault. This begins the Blood Night Massacre, and the Obsidian Empire is erased from history. The Exploration Empire retreats to their islands, which are the modern-day Deep Dark. They gather their whole naval fleet and blockade their borders. While people of the Obsidian Empire were suffering a fate worse than any other, Illager home life continued to improve. Technologically, Illagerian innovators began to develop early agricultural equipment, like automatic wheat farms, massive cattle ranges, and more. Enormous cities are re-risen, and the Illager Island citizenry have begun developing enormous government structures like high-block halls. In 850, a brief skirmish resulted from Illager agricultural pollution by villager nomads, but it didn't last long. Instead, they began building a quiet resistance network globally. Simultaneously, tribes of a distant, undiscovered continent began to form civilizations similar to the early five empires. In 887, the Illager Empire finally attacked the Exploration Empire with dozens of brutal naval battles. Several thousand families evacuated by boat, setting sail south in hopes of finding more land. Eventually, they do come across the continent of Dalka, living alongside the previously mentioned tribes who welcomed them in. By 897, the Illager Empire invented the first TNT, weak by our standards, but incredibly destructive for its time. Mechanisms to launch it were swiftly attached to boats, and Illager ships begin decimating Exploration Empire naval fleets. The Illager Empire finally breaks past their defenses and gets inland. They decimate the cities and towns with crossbow-wielding soldiers and basic TNT machines. The last exploration stronghold, Sky Harbor, is stormed by 300,000 Illager berserkers who launch from burning ships onto the walls. The battle is so brutal that the sea turns black with ash and red with blood. The Exploration Empire finally falls, and so came the end of a human era near the turn of the second millennium. Everything, except the unknown Dalkan lands, was Illager Empire territory. Only a few small villages and travelers survived. Around this time, the first basic industrial machinery was developed, like blast furnaces, larger production facilities to fuel shops, and the Illagerian economy boomed. However, the Illager Empire was also increasingly authoritative, enslaving villagers and builders as blame for the recent war, and racially motivated violence skyrocketed. The world is dystopian for non-Illagers. Dozens of villager exodus tribes are brutally tortured and slaughtered. Life slowly began to stabilize for some, after everything became occupied by the Illager Empire with the rise of the 10th century. Some escaped north into the mountains where Illager supervision was rare. But most people didn't have the skills to survive alone, and were forced to live in the large cities where non-Illagers faced constant scrutiny. But after the villager massacres, the Illager Empire fortunately stopped killing as much. That didn't make it pleasant to live with them, however. There were constant beatings, public shamings. Sometimes builders were even sentenced to death for minor crimes. Many people still spoke Villagerian, also known as English, but they were often scrutinized and forced to speak Illagerian when in public. Many still taught their children Villagerian to not let the language die. In fact, halfway through the century, in 955, a group of former Aurelian scholars actually determined the shape of the continent, but their findings were denounced and banned, and the scholars were imprisoned for life, as the Arch-Illager did not want intelligence associated with anyone but Illagers. Over the course of the century, the continent finally gained a name as the Illagers believed it had been tamed, calling it Rilidania, which is Illagerian for Riverland, thus giving us the continent name we know today. For a few generations, life stayed this way. However, the secret resistance networks building since the Slag Wars had been building larger and larger, and this global conquering only made them more determined to grow larger and fight harder. So, in 989, 3 countries born of the resistance network led by builders emerge: Waterland, Trident, and the Entern Empire, and together they take their combined strength to wage war on the Illager Empire, thus beginning the War for Rilidania. The nations are less so 3 independent states, but rather a 3-party conglomerate. The nations expanded cautiously at first. They secured scattered villages. They pushed toward the Arctic coastline. The Entern Empire fortified the south, constructing layered defenses against inevitable reprisal. Waterland, surrounded by sea and necessity, began constructing ships at unprecedented speed and capturing Illagerian vessels whenever possible. In 991, after years of grinding stalemate, dozens of occupied villages rose in coordinated rebellion. They declared independence openly. They fought without illusion. But the Illager Empire responded with execution, and the uprisings were crushed. But later, records revealed the truth. The rebellions had not been pointless. Their sacrifice masked a far larger operation, a full-scale invasion targeting the Entern Empire. And in the chaos, several northern island camps survived. They sent letters, and Waterland answered. Boats arrived, and survivors were extracted under Illager patrol routes. Through 995, the front lines barely shifted. Yet something else moved. Refugees, villagers and builders fled from across the continent. They crossed tundra, forests, frozen straits. They escaped Illager occupation and joined the resistance. The resistance became continental. Then, 996 became one of the most violent years of the war. Waterland retook the northern islands by sea. Illagerian ships burned in their own harbors. A major city was torched. Soon after, the Entern Empire and Waterland executed a joint campaign severing the Illager Empire's connection to the northwest. The Illager response was immediate. They regrouped and launched west into Trident. But the empire had stretched too far. In the vacuum left behind, a villager resistance cell rose openly and named itself the Brook. It was not large, it was not well equipped, but it understood something the empire had forgotten: geography. The Illagers were completely cornered not by a massive army's strength, but rather by scale. Each time they shifted armies across the enormous continent, another region just ignited behind them. So, in a strategically desperate bid, the Arch-Illager chose escalation. The Entern Empire had to fall. If the Entern Empire collapsed, resistance elsewhere would fracture. And a brutal southern invasion was prepared. but it never fully materialized. The Brooke learned of the plan, and in what was widely understood to be a suicide operation, they launched a direct naval assault on the Illager Island itself. It was meant to distract, but 87% of their ships survived the crossing. Several even established temporary camps before being eradicated. The invasion did not win territory, but it did buy time in the form of 1 year of strategic hesitation, 1 year of breathing room. But after that, the Illager Empire retaliated in the summer of 997 with near-total fury. They reclaimed their islands. They shattered coastal defenses. Waterland lost its coastline and its navy was destroyed. Trident attempted a desperate coastal breakthrough and was nearly erased from the map. As cities burned, the Entern Empire did something historians still debate. Every available man and woman marched south in one final offensive, simply to buy even more time. Every move now was just a bid for more time. The charge became known as Selva Rilidania, Save Rilidania. The Illagers countered through the mountains, attempting to crush Entern from above. But their troops, hardened for southern climates, faltered in the cold elevations. And so, the campaign ended in stalemate. Most Entern soldiers collapsed from exhaustion before withdrawing, but the objective was achieved. Their allies rebuilt. In 1005, the Entern Empire began a massive mining expansion in the mountains. Iron, coal, and rare ores surged into Allied hands. What followed was weapons, armor, and enormous scale. The Allies began dominating the continent. Waterland reached the Brooke. Together, they reclaimed the northwest. Illagerian generals captured in battle were executed, their heads sent to the Illager Empire as a message. In 1013, the Illager Empire struck back with another devastating continental recapture. For nearly a decade, no side achieved decisive advance. In 1023, the Entern Empire rose again as a war machine. With Allied coordination, they reclaimed nearly the entire continent. By October 28th, observers believed the war was finally ending. They were wrong, because in 1032, in what remains one of the most destructive final offensives in recorded history, the Illager Empire committed everything. They succeeded in devastating nearly every opposing nation. Only Entern and Waterland survived, and barely. Population collapse followed. Nearly half the world was gone. Villagers were so diminished they were catalogued as a near-extinct species. But this invasion was costly for the Illagers too. It ended up being their final undoing. Finally, after immeasurable bloodshed, another decade of guerrilla warfare finally rid the continent of its conquerors. The Entern Empire rebuilt the fallen nations and helped new ones rise. The coasts were fortified quickly, and finally, the war for Rilidania was over. Peace was achieved. The next few hundred years were mostly cultural progression and technology innovation. The population didn't return to its pre-war levels until 1176, which is around the time the first herb-based medicines were crafted, and the Entern Empire led the scientific community. In 1222, the continent of Dalka saw its first unified nations, the Cerulean Grasslands Confederacy and the Atrian clans. Meanwhile, the mainland saw immense progression in material science, evolutionary theories, astronomy, and more. By 1326, the population had officially doubled since its pre-war levels, and the first population census occurs, counting the global population at 63 million. Waterland advances naval technology, becoming an undisputed naval power. Highly advanced redstone mechanisms are finally made possible, beginning an explosively progressive era of technological comfort. For 400 years after the war, peace is achieved. The Brooke and Waterland have a brief scuttle after a criminal from Waterland assassinated a large political figure from the Brooke. and many had long forgotten the bond they shared from the last war. The war ends with the Brooks' victory, but both countries' economies are crippled. As a result, Wetland breaks into three sides. The Brook enters the war with the opposing sides, Calipare and Gentoo. However, little fighting occurs, and a peace treaty is signed. The Brook separates and allows their islands to be liberated as their own country, Krill, in 1447. This is also the believed birth year of a man named Steve, whose origin is unknown. Later, in 1456, End and Nether civilizations, in the stars and beneath the earth, begin to bloom, far more unified than their Earth counterparts. By 1489, the Nether Kingdom is formed by the ruler of the Piglin tribes, Hogmarn, nicknamed the Unifier of Hell. Once a land of death and tribal war for the past 30 years, they now have an official government, but are unaware of the overworld. In 1501, builders discovered portals to access both realms. At this time, it was believed the two lands were entirely new universes. In 1521, there is another brief civil war known as the Fracture War, where the nation Sanalin broke apart into 4 nations. Sanalin maintained independence, but Ader, Fjord, and Selenia were risen. This marks the end of the dark, conquest-ridden age of the last millennium, and marks the beginning of a new age, the Age of Revolution. By 1532, the builders enslave and kill Endermen, creating the End Stronghold. Some Endermen flee into the Nether to find a safe place among the Piglin tribes. Meanwhile, the Ender Dragon chases out the builders temporarily. Meanwhile, in 1540's Dalka, the Atrian clans advance into a unified Atrian Empire, speaking Villagerian thanks to the immigrants from many centuries ago. In 1555, the Nether also successfully repels builder invaders. In 1559, the Deep Dark seems to have hopped on the train of independence. The Warden, long a primal, cave dweller, has grown much more intelligent and even learned languages. He learns of the world beyond and how Illagers have claimed his island, and he fights back. The Illagers are no match for his utter brute strength, and are easily repelled. This angers Arch-Illager Makvu, who begins plotting an invasion to keep his empire strong. In 1561, Selenia falls victim to pirating, and the Illager Empire is quick to assist the pirates, leading to the Illager Empire taking over Selenia and gaining land access, a move that terrifies the rest of the continent. It moves in and claims the land the Entern Empire earlier put into secession, rapidly advancing. By 1563, all villages in its territory have become slave labor camps, but the world is too frightened to do anything about it. In 1573, the Nether breaks into the overworld, into Trident, and begins a mass invasion of revenge on the builders. The Illagers learn about this and seek to establish an alliance, claiming they too have long suffered due to builder tyranny. However, Illagers actually don't mind builders at this time period and despise villagers far more. The Nether, seeking a technologically advanced ally, agrees. Global tensions heat up rapidly as the Nether overthrows the majority of Trident, turning the nation into an all-out war zone. The Nether people are not able to survive in Waterland's wet environments, so Waterland gains the territory they do not claim. In 1590, the Entern Empire and Illager Empire have been making substantial threats toward each other as the Illager Empire conquers the nation of Foliage as a puppet state and takes over much of Calipare and Gentoo. To make matters worse, yellow fever outbreaks occur, spiraling Foliage into anarchy. In 1623, one of history's most influential figures is born in the Entern Empire, William Johnson. His mother passes away of yellow fever shortly after his birth, and his father catches it soon after. He dedicates his final days to teaching young William combat. Meanwhile, Steve is fighting for villagers to keep them alive. Steve is not a political man and is loyal to no nation, but he is fiercely protective of the innocent people, like villagers, and always seeks to do the right thing. In 1636, William Johnson moves out east into the Illager Empire territory after his father dies, since they provide benefits for builders, and William Johnson is desperate to begin a farm. Quickly, he begins to dislike the slave labor and racist treatment of villagers which he wasn't told about. In 1644, William Johnson waged a war that would forever alter the course of history. The legendary beginning of the Revolutionary War occurred when William Johnson, alone, fought off a small raid group of 24 Illagers torturing a village and saved its people from certain death. Miraculously, just hours before the Illager Empire marched into Sandlin to initiate the tidal wave plan, and as the Nether Kingdom marched into Trident, where they would jointly decimate nations across the continent, William Johnson declared independence from the Illager Empire, prepared to fight a war for the villagers. Thus, the Great Villager War, or the Revolutionary War, began. He called this nation the United Villager Nation, a name that history would come to remember forever. After designing the first flag, he would set up camp and prepare for battle. He donned a beautiful blue coat and a tricorn hat, and despite the overwhelming odds against him, William was ready to destroy 2 empires alone, or die trying. For months, he and his army held their ground against the Illager Empire successfully. But they would suffer an enormous loss after the bombing of Camp Ironia. Days after that bombing, Illagers torched William Johnson's presidential cabin, and this initiated a final coastal battle where dozens of Illagers were slaughtered and a ship was destroyed. William's army reigned supreme, and William himself killed a notorious Illagerian commander who was known for being undefeated in sword combat. A few weeks later, the Entern Empire, inspired by the UVN's success and resilience, would join the war in support of the UVN, and the war rapidly came to a close, resulting in the UVN's victory. Foliage was liberated, and Arch-Illiger Macvul was furious. In honor of the UVN, Foliage named one of their towns Ironia after the devastated camp. Sanilin seized the opportunity to reclaim its former territory and declared war on the Illager Empire and attacked. And in light of this, Foliage, Caliper, and Gentoo were able to reform and sent reparations to the UVN as a thanks, which the UVN used to build its infrastructure. The tidal wave assault is halted and rendered useless, all thanks to William Johnson. Steve also signs the UVN Constitution. Though a largely apolitical figure, he supported the UVN's cause immensely. By the war's end, the UVN is seen as something of a lucky disruption, but not fully intimidating. The Entern Empire became the UVN's first formal ally, and Caliper, Foliage, and Gentoo followed suit shortly after. In 1649, the large war between the Overnether and Trident causes enormous instability, forming a tier resulting in 2 new countries, Triton, the original nation renamed, and Nastion. Foliage gains a large part of the former Trident. The Entern Empire creates an independence referendum because of the territory's vastly differing geography, which results in Amore becoming a territory of its own. Then, in 1650, Triton, who was building a large force, attacks the Overnether, who is left wrecked. As a result, Layson, Manatee, and Alba form from independence groups. Through the assistance of the Deep Dark, the Marina gains independence, and months later it splits into another sovereign entity due to poor leadership from the Marina. Beluga is formed. Around this time, the UVN was locked into naval battles with pirates as its army grew. A famous home for pirates was Providence Island, a land unsupervised by any nation, and where many infamous crews would hide out to escape laws and set their own code of thieves to live by in an attempt to escape modern civilization. The island was owned by a man known only as Mr. Guthrie, who would trick the pirates into thinking he was helping them by buying goods they stole from UVN ships. However, Guthrie actually gave back the stolen items and gave them the pirates' money he secretly stole from their hideouts, effectively robbing the robbers. Mr. Guthrie even used this tactic to help the UVN in its Revolutionary War, as his parents were killed by illagers many years ago. The Illager Empire, being an island nation, contributed much of the capture and eradication of pirates through the next few decades. The UVN also contributed significantly with a warship called the Man-O-War, which took down as many as 4 dozen pirate crews. As the age of pirates raged on in the seas, life after the UVN Revolutionary War became, fortunately, quiet for the next 2 decades. But when the time came, in 1669, the Illager Empire launched Operation Ender Takeover, a plan to conquer the End Dimension to weaponize the dragon, feeling threatened by the dominance of the new nations. Just months later, in 1670, the End had nearly crumbled entirely, and they begged the international community to be saved. But only the UVN showed up. William Johnson's stance on anti-imperialism was firm, which prompted him to send forces and fight in the war himself. Around this time, early redstone-powered planes were being developed, though they functioned more like glorified gliders. In 1672, the UVN successfully liberated the End and kicked out the Illager Empire, gaining a new ally and international respect. The Illager Empire was not satisfied, however, and launched another attack on the Deep Dark to reclaim some of its land, desperate for an advantage. The UVN, again, showed up to defend the nation. However, it was far more difficult because they were in the Empire's backyard. Fortunately, the Warden's brute strength got just enough push from UVN forces to once again repel a massive Illagerian army, especially thanks to William Johnson's combat expertise. By 1684, the Deep Dark is liberated and the nations are allied. Wetland officially becomes an ally of the UVN. By now, the UVN had finished making a basic government structure, and William Johnson was going to resign, but the people wanted to elect him until death. Roughly a year later, in 1685, Beluga and the Marina got entrenched in a war, but Beluga overcame its opponents and conquered the island. In 1686, Foliage invented the first iron and copper golems, just as the Illager Empire invested a ton of a force into mass production of airplanes. To gain a foothold on the mainland, the Illager Empire allied with Nastian and Krill. Sandlin, an enemy of Nastian's, allied with the UVN to stay safe. The Brook does the same, as an enemy of Krill. Unfortunately, in 1689, William Johnson finally succumbed to old age and passed away, leaving behind a remarkable legacy. President Jacoby Smith would take his place. In 1691, the Illager Empire, finally prepared to enact revenge, declared war on the Entern Empire and UVN. It would subsequently bomb both nations with planes, a technology neither nation had. Being unable to attack in the sky, the UVN rapidly deployed its Man-O-War and managed to advance on Illagerian coasts. Meanwhile, the Entern Empire developed basic anti-air cannons, which were ineffective but provided some defense. The Nether Kingdom would then join the war. The UVN requested the assistance of the Deep Dark, and the Warden answered the call. This began the First World War. The Illager Empire advanced into Entern Mountains, bombed from the sky, and attacked UVN coasts. Both nations, supported by the Warden, Foliage, and Gentoo, encircled Illigerian coasts. The UVN later led many frontline assaults against the Nether Kingdom and its portals in Nastion, while the Entern Empire held back the Illiger Empire. In 1712, as one war began to simmer, another exploded in the world beyond, Dalka. The Cerulean grasslands gained independence from the Atrian Empire, and political controversy that followed resulted in the nation splitting into an east and west as a result of the Civil War. In 1714, the Illiger Empire finally retreated, as its coasts were at risk of being breached. The Nether Kingdom subsequently surrendered. Tensions between UVN and Nastion rise, as Nastion believes it was unfairly destroyed as a middle ground in the war. Those tensions would explode again in 1719, when the two declared war on one another. Nastion secured borders with UVN, and in response the UVN planned to go through Sanilin to surprise Nastion from the south. Nastion, however, actually anticipated this maneuver and pushed UVN forces south, taking a Sanilin city. All the while, another nation, calling itself the Victorian Brotherhood, fought for its own independence from Laysen's totalitarian monarchy and requested UVN assistance. The UVN answered the call, stretching its forces thin. However, the UVN was more concerned about doing what was right. This act sparks the Second World War. The Entern Empire provides bombing assistance on Nastion, but the UVN still does not succeed, facing their first loss. However, the UVN successfully destroys a Laysonian city, gaining the Victorians independence. The UVN co-signed a treaty written by the Victorian Republic to end the World War, a treaty infamous for its poor writing, which read, "Nastion must exit the war. The UVN keeps the northern cities of Nastion they overthrew. Nastion keeps the territory they stole. Victorian Republic shall now henceforth control the Laysonian government." Sanilin, however, is outraged at the treaty a few weeks after signing it, vowing revenge. In 1724, Sanilin officially renamed themselves to Sandlin, and very quickly stormed Nastion, reclaiming their lost city. However, the storm it was unleashing had merely just begun. In under 6 months, Sandlin entirely decimated Nastion and completely overthrew it. It would then completely destroy Triton, Caliper, and Wetland just the same. The international community panics, but allies of Sandlin try to stay quiet. After that, by 1725, it seizes Eider, Fjord, Manatee, and half of Gentoo, through a tactic involving rapid bomb deployment and then quick, overwhelming infantry. However, the UVN requests them to not destroy Gentoo or the Victorian Brotherhood, and Sandlin, still loyal to the UVN that saved it, agrees. Immediately, they start calling themselves the Lin Empire, and develop enormous bombs known as proto-nukes. Nukes in the 1700s were not nuclear or atomic weapons of mass destruction, but rather a colloquial term for a massive explosive. One TNT block was equal to 1 ton, and these bombs were equal to roughly 500 tons of TNT each. Rebel groups attempt independence from the Lin Empire but are nuked into complete oblivion. The UVN and Entern Empire are able to bribe the Lin Empire into stopping the use of nukes, but the climate change consequences are already irreversible. It's said that the freezing of the ice caps as a result lowered sea levels just barely, but it was enough to expose an island off the coast of the Victorian Brotherhood. For the time being, the bribe works enough that no major war occurs until 1792. At that time, Jackson Green is serving his 4th and final term, facing immense controversy about his lack of efforts against the Lin Empire, despite lacking the ability to do anything. Protesters were so fed up that in 1796 the UVN fell into a civil war. The opposing party sought to establish dictatorship in the UVN, so it would be easier to pass war declarations on the Lin Empire. And in 1802, that opposing side tragically won, and the UVN was plagued by anarchy. Jackson Green was publicly and unceremoniously executed in the streets. The subsequent dictator renames the nation the Great Villager Empire, or GVE. The GVE is governed by a very elusive and completely anonymous military strategist, known only as the Faceless Tyrant by some. In 1803, war began. The GVE diluted the Lin Empire's bombs by sending in sacrificial attack parties that were deceptively small. The Lin Empire believed a full army was attacking and wasted massive numbers of bombs on initial frontline assaults. Once supplies were exhausted, the GVE stormed in with its true armies and drafted millions of innocent civilians to bleed on the front lines. The GVE completely overthrew the Lin Empire by 1809. The Faceless Tyrant even granted the Victorian Brotherhood land. By 1834, the GVE grew greedy for more land and set out to discover more, coming across the continent of Dalka. Immediately, it intervenes in the Atrian Civil War by rapidly destroying the democratic East and conquering the Cerulean grasslands. The GVE is now the largest empire in history, even larger than the Illager Empire at its peak. And in 1845, the GVE began to impose a tax on the Eastern Atrian Empire, claiming it was only fair for winning their war. And that's when the Atrians made the bold move to send a team of spies to escape Dalka and find allies to attack the GVE with. There, they managed to consult with the Illager Empire, and for the first time in history, two distant continents of humans connected and made an alliance. In 1851, Atria is united by General Jacobs, who with his army single-handedly drove out the GVE thanks to their low force concentration in the region. By 1853, the Dalkan nations broke inland to Reledania, and with the Illager Empire grinded towards the capital. The war finally culminated in 1854, with a death toll of 3 million, when all forces reached the capital. The armies of all sides were wearing thin, and the GVE successfully forced Atria and Ari Illager Empire into surrender. However, a UVN rebel camp had rushed in and finally executed the Faceless Tyrant, ending his reign. What followed was decades of rebuilding. The former Cerulean grasslands became Orton. Atria unified and kept contact with Reledania, and the UVN managed to reform, almost identical to how it was before. The new era did not bring peace, however. While the UVN managed to grow to an unprecedented size and was back on the track of recovery, the empty soil left a power vacuum and thousands of raging paramilitaries ready to conquer it. Luminara and Alardonia were the first nations born of this war, which was known as the Territory War. Hallan formed shortly after, and by 1855, the three nations successfully fought their way to freedom. But the northern jungles and plains were still a war-torn land that didn't settle until 1870, where 6 nations emerged: Illageria, Lafri, Riro, Hunern, Libertaria, and Artsadonia. Peace would last after the nations settled for the rest of the century. And, due to their golem workforce and military, Foliage became the United Golem Nation, or UGN. In the lengthy peacetime, several major developments occurred, like the invention of radar inside the Illager Empire, or the radio by the Entern Empire. The first real planes were developed, and engines and robust industrial machinery along with it, all of which spread quickly and globally. Unfortunately, it only made what came next over the next 2 decades far more devastating. First, a brief war called the Illigerian Conflict. The nation of Illigeria was starving to outcompete its neighbors, and secretly formed a deal with the Illiger Empire to get their best weaponry and soldiers to take over the Victorian Brotherhood. However, none of the nations even knew the Illiger Empire were involved, and were surprised at Illigeria's effectiveness at invasion. It turned out the Illiger Empire had intentionally initiated this proxy war to gain control over the mainland. The UVN was the first to respond to support its allies. It sent troops by boat in the late months of 1899, but President Robert Campbell knew this was an unsustainable tactic. However, the raging Allardonia-Artsidonia bombing conflict made it impossible to reach the Victorians by land, so the UVN plotted to destroy Artsidonia and form an alliance with Allardonia. For the next 2 years, the UVN and Victorian Brotherhood were locked into a struggle. They couldn't understand how a newly emerged, weak nation was defeating their armies. In 1901, the UVN finally managed to peacefully resolve the Allardonia-Artsidonia bombing conflict and ally with both nations. It was subsequently able to move land troops into the battle, which significantly hindered Illigeria's ability to move forward. That same year, the UGN joins the war with the UVN, and the two nations bomb the Illigerian border. Illigeria responded by pushing the threat of proto-nukes forward. Outside the war, the world's first global newspaper network was founded in the UVN, the Villager Times. With increasing technology, many small islands were located, and nations made claims very quickly. In 1902, the UGN suddenly withdrew from the war, but wouldn't specify why. However, the UVN is still able to make it past Illigeria's borders, advancing toward the capital. The Illiger Empire finally made a statement, declaring they indeed had been supplying Illigeria, and would supply it nukes if it fell. As tensions ramped up, the Arch-Illiger would suddenly pass away from a heart attack, and the Arch-Illiger who took his place, Elter, swiftly ended the war. Elter offered the Victorian Brotherhood 41 million emeralds in reparations, and it gained a large portion of Illigeria and Hoonern's territories. The UVN developed welfare programs to help the Victorian citizens recover. In case of another war, the UVN also quietly developed super camps in Gentoo, the UGN, and its largest one resided in the Victorian Brotherhood. Colonel Voller, who led many battles in the Illigerian conflict, was sentenced to 32 life sentences. The nation of Illigeria fell into a deep depression, and its citizens greatly suffered from poverty. The year concluded with a brief skirmish where the Deep Dark fought to own the historical Providence Island for unknown reasons. Luminara did not fight for long, and quickly gave it up. However, anyone thinking conflict ended there was gravely mistaken. The Illiger Empire immediately and forcibly annexed Riro, Lafri, Hoonern, Illigeria, and Libertaria for one simple reason.
Like this?
Yeah, just keep like that for the front.
On March 3, 1903, weeks after the annexation, the Illiger Empire immediately invaded the Victorian Brotherhood by bombing its coasts. In a mere week, the already battered Victorian Brotherhood lost 45% of its territory to the invasion. The Fourth World War began. Fortunately, the UVN super camp prevented a complete takeover in the initial 48 hours and stopped a storming of major cities, but the surrounding small towns were not so lucky, and the Victorian Brotherhood's allies had limited time to act. It is around this time George Brockman, an infamously brilliant war strategist, becomes president of the UVN. Immediately, he rallied a massive coalition in support of the Victorian Brotherhood. The Entern Empire, Amor, Gentoo, the Deep Dark, the UGN, Orton, and even Beluga all volunteered for the coalition and rapidly deployed their troops to St. Frederick's, the capital of the Victorian Brotherhood. Illager forces later landed in Luminara, evading the UVN Navy. They would then launch a large assault on Artsidonia and Alardonia, who barely stood their ground, and only because Illager forces were stretched thin here. As the Illager Empire's massive army grew, the Brotherhood's allies scrambled to defend it. While majority of the coalition rallied at St. Frederick's, the Entern Empire also diverted forces to the UVN supercamp alongside the Victorians, and to the east coast alongside the UVN. The UVN was the most versatile fighter, fighting even where the Victorians did not, the mainland, the coasts, and even Illager territory. The UVN alone was leading naval battles in the south. However, the struggle to secure the coasts was the most difficult task for the Allies. The Illagerian navy had long been the most numerous and the most powerful in the world. Initial efforts were catastrophic failures, particularly the Battle of the East Ocean on August 20th, 1902. On that day, dozens of UVN, Entern, and Victorian warships fought to capture the east coast. Even though they vastly outnumbered Illagerian ships, every last one still sank, and the Illagers won on a technicality. Even though their ships were also destroyed, Luminaran ships in the area remained unscathed, and so the coasts remained under Illager control. The Illagers only grew in power following this victory, and launched a full-scale assault on the city home to the supercamp, Brooklyn City. There, only the UVN was capable of arriving to the battle. A UVN general and Victorian commander hid inside a shelter and attempted to launch a stealth attack to kill the commanders in the area, but they were caught. Absolute destruction followed in the form of bombs, gunfire, and waves of soldiers, and while they successfully repelled the Illager Empire, Brooklyn City was nearly flattened by bombing at the end. Everyone, George Brockman especially, knew this war needed to end fast. So he started pushing UVN forces directly onto the north side Illager Empire land, taking the jungle cities with rapid efficiency and severing supply lines. Now that they had been adequately weakened, Brockman devised a plan for a joint operation with the Entern Empire, Operation Blockstorm, a coastal invasion of the city Riverdale Heights. Because of the location, it more commonly referred to as the Riverdale Storming, and it was one of history's most legendary operations. Though the Illager Empire was the more powerful navy, the UVN maintained air and ground superiority, so an amphibious assault was considered the ideal move. The battle began with 2 UVN ships and a small Entern patrol boat facing off against 3 Illager ships. The Entern ship almost immediately sunk, and a UVN ship suffered irreparable damage, but didn't sink. After downing the Illager ships, more rushed into the area. The sole survivor ship, the VNS Darrington, carried thousands of Iron Wolves, the UVN's elite infantry force, which were meant to be the driving force of the amphibious assault. As the Iron Wolves deployed and rushed inland, the Darrington fired onto the coasts as thousands of Iron Wolves charged up the shore, dying to machine gun fire, landmines, barbed wire fences, fire, poison gas, and the unfortunate even drowned in the water. Paratroopers were launched, and some were shot out of the sky or had failing parachutes. The total from both sides was a staggering 25,000 soldiers perishing in under an hour. Illager ships also swarmed the coast, but this is where the Darrington and its captain would gain legendary statuses. As the Iron Wolves charged up shore, the Darrington held off over 5 enemy warships moving in, before Entern and Gentoo ships arrived and supported the Darrington. The coast had been secured, and the Iron Wolves continued their rush to Riverdale Heights. Gentoo soldiers even reportedly attacked their own captain because he refused to let them deploy, citing an extreme loyalty to the UVN and famously saying, "The wolves will not perish," or some variation, as the exact words are unknown. Dozens of Gentoo soldiers rushed on shore in rowboats of their own, ready to fight and bleed. Despite the coastal success, the nightmare was far from over for the Iron Wolves. The wolves charged up shore, tearing through Illager forces and backed by their Gentoo brothers. The Illagers fiercely held their ground, but this is exactly what Brockman anticipated. The Illager Empire believed it had won, but it underestimated UVN tactical intelligence. A sudden wave of UVN Standard Army soldiers and thousands of soldiers from other nations, all originating from the super camp, slammed into Riverdale Heights. The Illagers were entirely blindsided and lost the city in mere minutes. And then, in just weeks, the Illager Empire was forced to surrender as the Allies pushed north and reclaimed the Victorian Brotherhood. The UVN was forced to finish the war alone in the northern half as everyone else was suffering from recent attrition. Many political issues resulted in the Illager Empire briefly maintaining demilitarized zones on the mainland, but they were eventually forced out. After that, Alardonia and Artsidonia fought off and annexed Luminara together, strengthening their bond. In the aftermath, the UVN wanted to prevent another territory war, so it held on to the Illagerian land and called it the Temporary Occupational Territory, usually just referred to as the TOT as a shorthand. They eventually came to the decision to allow new nations to rise peacefully rather than distribute the land to allies, allowing people to band together and start a new life rather than inherit the debt that would come with the war-torn lands. These nations were aptly called the TOT nations. The first nation born of the territory was Valoria, which received welfare aid and military protection. By the start of 1904, Liberta, Retter, Boschna, and Aurora emerged, filling the territory. The UVN formally seceded, but maintained military presence to protect the new nations. The world finally saw peace again, but not for some. In 1904, Entern scientists claimed they had discovered that the over-nether was spreading. They believed the netherrack was creeping further into the overworld, and that it traveled via nether spores. The emperor of the Entern Empire was so terrified he declared war, calling the Nether Kingdom a terrorist state. But suddenly, a disease exploded across the continent. Originating from the Nether, it was called INFV-A, or Nether Sickness. Borders closed for the next 2 years, and the Entern Empire was forced to back down. Meanwhile, the world's leading nations began developing vaccines, primarily the economically booming and scientifically advanced UVN. The UVN led exceptional efforts against the disease under a scientist named Dr. Samuel Finch. In 1906, 3 vaccines were released. The UVN's, called Nether Shield, was considered the safest, most effective. Fortunately, that was it. INFVA still persisted, but only lasted for a 2-year pandemic before largely being extinguished. In 1919, George Brockman ended his second term by establishing the ICSS, the International Coalition for Security and Stability. It was a multinational assembly meant to prevent total chaos through wartime laws, restrictions on maritime borders, and provided an international court. Quickly, most nations joined in, and to wrap up a final era and begin the new decade, Dr. Velker made several highly notable inventions. Dr. Velker was a profoundly intelligent scientist in the Illager Empire, who invented the first machine guns and pistols, and the car. The UVN was able to follow suit later in the decade with the invention of the first rifles. What's currently considered the present day largely began with the election of President Andrew Jameson in 1930. The same year he was elected, the first antibiotics were invented in the Entern Empire, further stopping diseases like yellow fever and nether sickness. The UVN led on a new frontier by launching the world's first satellites into space. The Pioneer 1, which enabled the first radio communications from the UVN all the way to Atria, meaning they no longer had to contact the other continent with mail. The Illager Empire began to make amends with the UVN by collaborating with it on a scientific project still not revealed to this day. The next year, the Nether Kingdom announced the invention of the mace. It was a clear threat to the Warden and the Greater Deep Dark, but an inevitable one. As the Warden dominated battles for millennia, he was starting to be outpaced by technology. This led Andrew Jameson to deliver his iconic line in a speech, and the UVN sent 2,000 Iron Wolves to protect the Warden. Things only worsened when an Amorian spy was caught trying to assassinate Arch-Illager Varnick Dell. Amore intensely negotiated for the spy to be returned, but he was instead publicly executed. Furious, Amore declared war and began circling Illagerian coasts quietly. However, new Nether Kingdom planes that moved faster than any seen before bombed the ships, sinking them. That's when the Entern Empire declared war on the Nether Kingdom and began moving through various nations to reach it by land. They called the UVN to support them, as the three nations were bonded by the Temperist Sea Alliance, but Andrew Jameson declined.
And beyond these streets, across the land, millions more watch on the television from the comfort of their homes.
He recently made a controversial move, slashing the UVN military spending to focus it on other aspects to build the economy and return with a military of unprecedented strength. A move criticized by citizens and known as the Boomerang Superpower Strategy.
But let's be honest with ourselves. For years, for centuries, for as long as this nation has had military influence, we've been in a deadlock. Illageria always stood toe-to-toe with us. Every move we made, they countered, and every battle we won only made them more prepared for the next. That ends now. We're building, we're innovating, we're expanding at a rate others cannot even comprehend. And in the coming years, this economic might will fuel the most unstoppable military force the world has ever seen. We built massive new factories, vast farms stretching as far as the eye can see, all of it producing more than ever before, fueling trade, the economy, fueling the great people of this nation. The UVN is growing faster, stronger, and more powerful than any nation in history. William Johnson gave us freedom, Jacoby Smith developed us, Jackson Green brought us back from the dead, George Brockman gave us victories, and now, I give you the future.
While his speech was undoubtedly charismatic and faced no opposition, it was his move of slashing the military budget that faced criticism and put the UVN in a dangerous position. One only worsened by a recent Illagerian invention. The first nuclear fission weapons. A bomb more extraordinarily powerful than anything ever seen before. A weapon developed by Dr. Velker under the newly in power Arch-Illager Volmar. Arch-Illager Volmar, in his first days in power, also intervened in and ended the Temperist Rift War through diplomacy. The Entern Empire demanded justice, so Volmar ruthlessly had King Punkin of the Nether Kingdom executed. This triggered a coup in the Nether, causing it to reform under a new communist regime as the Nether Union. However, many underestimated Andrew Jameson's intelligence. Andrew Jameson was building a weapon not many could see, but one all would fear. A vastly superior economy, through various trade wars, imposing very strategic tolls and taxes, and convincing allies to adopt UVN emeralds, the UVN economy exploded in what felt like overnight. Competitors were unable to retaliate, depending on the UVN's high-tech redstone and machinery exports. 1938 came around, and it was one of history's most event-dense years. The UVN became an absolutely unrivaled economy, and while its military lagged behind, its education was the greatest of any nation. Its healthcare was absolutely innovative, and above all, its science department was the most advanced in the entire world. In that year, Arch-Iliger Volmar began to promote a fascist regime, one based on a principle that was historically unique to say the least, Ligurian supremacy. While Illigers have infamously slaughtered villagers, hated and occasionally tolerated builders at best, this was the first time in history an Illiger believed the Ligurians were some kind of superior race to the piglins and builders. It was also this year one of history's most famously unsolved mysteries began. In the UVN, the president has 6 presidential officers, functioning like assistant presidents. One of them, William Carter, had a sister named Angela Carter. Despite the two being builders, he would marry an Illigerian general, Colonel Velmer. Arch-Iliger Volmar would heavily detest the marriage because of his ideology, and in a move some would say isn't so mysterious, Angela's plane crashed outside Illigerian waters after the wedding. Nothing is confirmed, and everything is purely speculative, but many believe she was deliberately killed by Volmar. Velmer was too valuable to kill, and killing William Carter risked locking themselves into a war with the UVN. Yet, Angela was the perfect target, or so the theories say. On March 8th, Volmar hosted her funeral, and William attended, but he would make it home safely. On the grander geopolitical scale, the Entern Empire began to distance itself from the UVN, trying to convince allies like the Brooke, Amore, Gentoo, and the UGN to stay away from the so-called traitor. While the Brooke and Amore accepted without hesitation and the UGN would give no comment, Gentoo was as loyal to the UVN as always, and aggressively rejected the Entern Empire, even calling its leader a slur and telling them to F themselves. Later in the year, Amore would get a new president named Salvador Echeverria, whose sons died in the Temperest Rift War. He blames the UVN's refusal to intervene in the war for their deaths, and boldly, he invaded the UVN at its weakest moment. Amore stormed the Capitol building, destroying part of the building's offices, killing presidential officer William Carter and injuring Andrew Jameson. Almost immediately, UVN forces at Fort Lupus fought back with a ubiquitous and feral drive to defend their families. Amore would try to invade several times, but continually got pushed back. However, the UVN could not push into Amore either, as its soldiers lacked strong urban combat capability. The repeated amount of close calls near the capital led the enormously funded UVN Science Division to develop the light machine weapon, a type of heavy, handheld machine gun. It was a true stalemate for the remainder of the year until the UVN also developed the first submachine gun, the CC-ACW, or Close Quarters Combat Automatic Carbine Weapon. After weeks of fighting, Amore is finally destroyed and annexed by the UVN thanks to these inventions, as well as a naval invasion on Amorian coasts, and a portion of its land is sold to the Illiger Empire. Unfortunately, 1939 did not bring lasting peace. Orton suffered a total economic collapse and anarchy, leading to factions of paramilitaries fighting for dominance. Additionally, Boschna, Retter, and Liberta's leaders accused the UVN of mistreating them and having favoritism for Aurora and Valoria. The Retter leader would escalate things further, claiming he would kill Andrew Jameson and his family and burn his people. Jameson would just laugh at the statement when he was informed of it, comparing the leaders to whiny children, but taught resentment, and even global resentment for the UVN would grow exponentially. An aggressive multinational paramilitary would take control of the Tott governments, calling itself the TLA, or Tott Liberation Armies. The UVN was being further isolated when Artsedonia and Alardonia feared the weakened UVN was just more of a liability, and peacefully ended their alliance with it. The UVN was backed into a corner and losing allies, and many people doubted Andrew Jameson's strategy further. Meanwhile, Atria was facing its Red Scare crisis. A loophole in its constitution was unraveled by the president, which allowed him to strip citizens of their civil rights. He called for aggressive action against communists in the government, and surprisingly, the people would support it. The UVN placed the nation on an ICSS human rights watch list. Only weeks later, the Monday Massacre occurred, where many citizens who politically opposed Matthew Collins, women and children included, were forced to dig their own mass graves and were executed.
I stand here today, November 18, 1937, at the Hole, where suspected communists within the nation's government were executed yesterday on Monday.
Then, 8 of 10 of its Supreme Court members were killed as the building was set on fire. Atria would then form a strong alliance with the Illager Empire. Just weeks after that, 74 UVN citizens on a tour in Retter were killed by the TLA in an attack. The UVN subsequently banned all travel there and threatened the TLA to back down or face an invasion. It wasn't all bad, however, as the UVN also developed many technologies, most notably the nuclear fusion bomb. It was a weapon that far exceeded the explosive power of the Illager Empire's fission bombs, and enabled the UVN to finally stand up for itself in a world slowly turning on it. They also developed the Elytra, and an entire new branch of the military called ECOM, dedicated to Elytra Special Forces. They also successfully launched a massive fleet of satellites into space that would be used to improve weather forecasting, and the UVN became the world's only reliable source for weather reports on the radio. In an intriguing twist, they also developed the first rotary blade experiments, a step towards the world's only helicopters. At the end of the year, Dr. Velker fell ill, but the UVN immediately asked to take care of him. The Illager Empire was not hesitant to agree, extremely grateful that their Ligurian brothers were saving a valuable man of their own. At the start of 1940, Alardonia elected Orhan Bardakci, a charismatic leader promising to fix the food and economic crises the arid land caused. At the May monthly ICSS summit, the Entern Empire Emperor called Andrew Jameson a coward, claiming the UVN's glory days are long gone and that the nation has become weak. Andrew Jameson retorted with remarks about how the UVN has the vastly superior economy and the only nation to possess nuclear fusion bombs. Arch-Illager Volmar, something of a fan of the UVN, surprisingly snapped at him, shouting about builder inferiority and ordering him not to insult a Ligurian nation. Later, UVN scientists sent to study the nether infection that the Illager Empire allegedly cured discovered that the nether infection doesn't actually exist. When tested in laboratories, netherrack did not spread to earthly soil, not even on microscopic scales in lab conditions identical to the real-world environment. This greatly challenged the understanding of how portals work, and Andrew Jameson promised further research before his final year of presidency. Orhan Bardakci begins to take radical steps to fix Alardonia, like firing government officials. Alardonian citizens, however, have learnt from Atria's ongoing Red Scare crisis. Bardakci's opposition protests aggressively, demanding his impeachment. His supporters threaten the opposition. Bardakci begins to threaten his own civilians, as well as Artsedonian leadership after they order Bardakci to step down. Within a month, Artsedonia and Alardonia aggressively fractured into 6 independent states in a massive, desperate fight for survival, after Orhan Bardakci issued a missile threat resulting in the branches of the governments of both nations to take their own action, resulting in a multi-sided civil war. A UVN town was almost struck, and hundreds died per hour. In a few days, the civilian death toll plummeted as refugees flooded into the Victorian Brotherhood. However, after a missile struck the Victorian Brotherhood, many refugees in the Victorian Brotherhood quickly escaped to the Entern Empire, UVN and UGN. Gentoo decides to help the UVN and UGN, its only close allies, amid the rising crisis by helping them improve border security. This sparks a de facto alliance between the three nations. The Illager Empire, opportunizing the chaos, fully conquers Beluga. The Illager occupation of Beluga transformed the lively and proud island nation into a controlled society. Violence is typical, fear is constant, and normal life continues just barely. The Empire then launches plans to take over the unmanned territory, concluding the year with destruction and violence. In 1941, Andrew Jameson concluded the final year of his term with a massive civil rights campaign where he repealed harmful constitutional articles and helped people facing discrimination, like piglins, have civil liberties and equality. A deal proposed by the UGN results in Gentoo and the UGN building military bases inside the UVN to protect one another, and the UVN building a massive $2 billion military base in Gentoo's mountains, used to store 2 of the UVN's 5 nuclear fusion bombs. This acted as a deterrent to Krill, an ally of the Illager Empire, Nether Union, and Atria, who threatened Gentoo. The TLA formed an alliance with the Illager Empire and sent troops to Beluga as a gift. They then launched an invasion on the Victorian Brotherhood, which kills dozens and causes infrastructural harm, prompting the Entern Empire to join the war. While the Victorian Brotherhood did lose its jungle territories fairly quickly, they stood their ground in the plains and near the capital, and prevented civilian deaths with extreme effectiveness. The TLA would further attempt to stir trouble against the UVN and the Victorian Brotherhood and their allies by riling up the 6-state region. They prompted them to cause chaos through propaganda and threats, even trying to empower the Illager Empire through admirational words to maintain support and oppose, primarily the UVN, but also its allies. Then, Uskatani and the Victorian Brotherhood form an alliance and take over Saldona and Dost together. The 6-state war finally ended. But Faduzka ramped suspicious levels of defense on its coasts and border with the UVN. And that would conclude the full summary of the timeline so far. Wars are brewing all over the continent. Many nations are picking their sides and preparing to fight, and hostility is at an all-time high. Gentoo and the UGN are loyal allies of the UVN, all trying to remain neutral in this chaotic time. The 6-state, or rather 4-state region, remains hostile, broken, and simmering. The Illager Empire has been expanding aggressively, and no one has held it accountable. And it's gaining new terroristic allies. The Entern Empire has ended a centuries-long alliance with the UVN and convinced allies to distance themselves from it. And once again, the Victorian Brotherhood faces turmoil. Now, we all have many questions. How will the Illager Empire's alliance with the UVN affect the hostilities between the UVN and Illagerian allies? Will Andrew Jameson's economic strategy prove successful and allow the UVN to become an insurmountably powerful military? What sides will the 4-state region pick in the upcoming war? Is Krill going to cause an invasion on Gentoo or the Brook? Is World War V on the brink of breaking out? And most importantly, what comes next? This has only been a brief overview of the timeline on a geopolitical scale. Future documentaries will explore deeper angles of specific historical events. This video only scratches the surface of what there is to explore in what has already happened alone, not to mention the intense decades still to come. Until next time.